Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Accurate podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Friday the 12th of July in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Joe Biden confuses his vice president for rival Donald Trump at a vital moment for his embattled re-election bid.
NATO allies thwart a Russian plot to kill the CEO of a key German defence company.
Plus, France's fiscal constraints. Macron's vision of a centrist alliance falters as the EU pressures the country to reduce its deficit.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Joe Biden's re-election campaign is under renewed pressure after he made two critical errors in a closely scrutinised NATO news conference. Over a bilateral meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and a nearly hour-long news conference, the 81-year-old US president spoke confidently on a range of issues. But those interactions were overshadowed by Biden mistaking two of his biggest allies for his greatest enemies. Firstly, mixing up the Ukrainian leader and the Russian president.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. You can beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President.
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
And that was followed later by Biden confusing his vice president with his Republican rival for re-election, following this question.
What concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there.
The gasp from Biden came as he vowed to stay in the 2024 presidential race, saying he's the best qualified person to do the job. But almost immediately after the press conference ended, at least three more House Democrats, including the top member from his party on the Intelligence Committee, joined the growing list of lawmakers calling on him to step aside.
President Biden's mistakes followed reporting by the New York Times that several long-time advisers were discussing ways to persuade him to exit the race. Spokespeople for the president insist his team remain behind him. Bloomberg political contributor Gene Zino says that the press conference did little to allay Democrat fears about Biden's campaign.
What is going to stick in people's minds are the gaffes. Zelensky, Putin, Donald Trump, Harris, and a few others. The repetitions he made, the way he trailed off in questions. He is good on national security. He knows this business. It's a comfort zone for him. And yet I'm not sure it's going to have any impact on those people who are calling for him to drop out.
Gene Zino's analysis came after top White House and campaign officials were sent to Capitol Hill on Thursday to shore up support of concerned lawmakers. Meanwhile, Trump seized on Biden's error in naming him, posting on his social media site that Biden had done, quote, a great job.
European allies have uncovered a plot to assassinate the CEO of a major German defence company. It marks a significant escalation in what the US and Europe say is hybrid warfare by Russia. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has more.
A plan to kill the CEO of Rheinmetall was thwarted by German security services thanks to US intelligence. According to CNN, the attempt is linked to a series of Russian plots to kill defense executives in Europe whose companies produce weapons for Ukraine. US officials declined to comment on the specifics of the scheme or confirm its existence. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has told reporters Russia is leading a hybrid war of aggression, and Rheinmetall CEO Armin Papager was given special protection as a result. The move comes as the US and its allies say President Putin has stepped up the number of coordinated assassinations, cyber attacks and other actions since the outbreak of the war with Ukraine. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
Now, Emmanuel Macron is trying to ease concern about his country's political turmoil among his NATO colleagues and that it won't affect his ability to support the alliance's goals, especially on Ukraine. In conversations and a speech, the French president has tried to allay worries over the snap election result in France, but Macron's calls for a centrist parliamentary alliance have been met with considerable pushback from lawmakers. Parties across the political spectrum rejected Macron's appeal for, quote, Republican forces to form a coalition, leaving no clear way forwards to forming a stable government.
Well, France's next government will need to find more than 15 billion euros in extra revenue or savings a year to meet European Union demands. Bloomberg understands the figure was included in a proposal that the European Commission sent to Paris last month. The adjustment equates to around 0.55% of annual GDP over 7 years. But agreeing to spending cuts may prove difficult for President Macron after snap elections left the country with a hung parliament divided on budget policy.
US inflation cooled to the slowest pace in 3 years, sending the strongest signal yet that rate cuts are on the horizon. The Consumer Price Index climbed 0.1% in May on a core basis. The Chicago Fed chief Austan Goolsbee described the data as the evidence that he'd been waiting for. Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet has more.
In a conversation with reporters, Goolsbee added that the numbers provided the evidence he has been waiting for to be confident that the central bank is on a path to its 2% goal. Goolsbee declined to offer guidance on the timing of the first interest rate cut. Still, he emphasized the importance of the deceleration and shelter inflation in recent months, calling it profoundly encouraging. The Chicago Fed chief has been closely watching that category to determine when the central bank should lower borrowing costs. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
Britain's mortgage holders were behind some of the Labour Party's gains in last week's general election. Analysis of the results by Hampton suggests those hit by high mortgages were some of those most likely to vote Labour. James Woolcock has the story.
Labour won seats across the country in their landslide election. Now, property firm Hamptons has looked at house ownership trends in those seats that the party has taken over. They found those with mortgages were most likely to have swapped from Conservatives to Labour, and those who own homes outright were relatively more likely to move from the Tories to other parties. The data doesn't suggest why voters switched, but Labour have promised to turbocharge house building after jumps in both mortgages and house prices in recent years. In London, James Woolcock, Bloomberg Radio.
In a moment, we'll bring you more on Joe Biden's performance in that NATO summit press conference, plus the latest on government formation talks in Paris and some of the financial challenges that France is facing. But first, a great read on the terminal this morning around Keir Starmer and what England winning the Euros could mean for him.
Absolutely. I am a fair weather football fan. I will say that outright. Keir Starmer is not. The new UK Prime Minister, of course, says he's played football basically every weekend since the age of 10. He's a total diehard fan. And of course, the England men's football team is on the brink. It has got this one final now. Perhaps this would be England winning the first major tournament in 6 decades. And this piece is all about actually how this could give a lift to the Labour Prime Minister because he is such an authentic footy fan.
But that's it. I mean, there's so many gaffes if you go back through previous Prime Ministers of those pretending to like football who don't really. I mean, during the election campaign, Rishi Sunak asking people in Wales they're looking forward to the Euros, and Wales hadn't even qualified for the Euros. So, I mean, look, this is a chance for a Prime Minister who is a genuine fan to have his moment. It's sort of a reminder of you know, the picture of Emmanuel Macron of France in the Stade de France when France were winning as well. You know, this is kind of incredible picture of him as well. Perhaps there'll be a Keir Starmer moment in Berlin as well this weekend.
Oh, well, let's hope so. Yeah, certainly for Gareth Southgate and his team. Anyway, it's a very nice piece on the Bloomberg terminal for you this morning. Let's also, they think, a little bit more about, well, what was happening in the US. President Biden, you heard some snippets of it. The audience was hanging on every word of President Biden's first solo press conference of this year. He vowed to stay in the presidential race, but he made some critical errors. He mistakenly introduced the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as Russia's president, and he also fumbled a question about Vice President Kamala Harris. Joining us now to discuss this is Ben Sills, our managing editor for European Government and Economics. Ben, good morning. Thank you for being with us. I mean, it was a critical moment, wasn't it? What emerged?
Yeah, the trouble is for Biden is that every time he speaks publicly like this, it's going to be a critical moment, and it's just it's completely distracting from the business of governing, from what message he might want to get out, it's distracting for the leaders around him. The mood that we were picking up from the other NATO leaders, I was kind of checking in with some of our reporters overnight, And the rest of the delegation is kind of just feeling pretty sad about it. They like him, they respect him, they have a lot of gratitude, I think, for what he's achieved in this term. But it's very difficult to watch, and you can't even really listen to what he's saying because you're just kind of so worried that the next thing that comes out of his mouth is going to involve some kind of mistake.
How much of a concern is this for those other NATO countries as well? I mean, this was an event where Joe Biden was front and centre. There were big and serious issues to be discussed. Are they concerned about, I suppose, what happens next?
I think that they are probably concerned about how the Democrats are going to deal with this. We're seeing increasing reports. There's a kind of steady drip over the last several weeks of pressure on Biden to step aside. There has to be concern about the way it will affect the race if that process drags on. How the Democrats will execute that pivot to another candidate, if indeed they do that, will affect the race. They're obviously, in the background, you have Donald Trump, and another Donald Trump presidency would obviously be uncomfortable for the Europeans, although they have, to a certain extent, resigned themselves to that possibility. I wouldn't say they think it's a done deal, but they're very realistic about the fact that it might happen. So there are lots of dimensions that make this really, really awkward for the Europeans. But fundamentally, it's an awkward thing for Team Biden and his family and his advisors to try and navigate.
Yeah, it is, and so. Yes, I mean, if you delve into the issues of what happens next, can the president stay in the re-election race, and what happens next in terms of the Democrats? I thought the most interesting line, and I didn't understand this about US politics, but the money that President Biden has raised, that $230 million of cash, it would only automatically be transferred to the vice president. It would take longer to transfer that money to another candidate. So partly it's about the funding for the US presidential race. What do you think might happen next?
I think that's one of the reasons why Kamala Harris is the favourite to take over. I think that there are also there's a lot of discussion about the prospects of her candidacy at the moment. She has traditionally you speak to colleagues in the US, and they always say that Harris is flawed, that there's something missing in the way that she approaches voters, and that she struggles to connect with them. I think that, however, if she were to become the actual candidate, there is clearly an opportunity for a reset there. It would be a risk, but every option here is risky for the Democrats because of the situation they've got themselves into.
Yeah.
I think Harris is the top name that you have to consider.
Okay, Ben Sells, thanks very much for joining us this morning, our managing editor for European Economics and Government. Now, after a snap election in France resulted in a hung parliament, President Macron's call to build a majority from the centre-left and centre-right parties appears to have been rejected. The left-wing alliance, the New Popular Front, insists they have the mandate to nominate a prime minister. Meanwhile, Bloomberg has learned that France will need to find €15 billion in savings or revenue to meet EU budget demands. Joining us now for more from Paris is our bureau chief, Alan Katz. Alan, good morning. So Macron's idea of a centrist alliance has floundered. Where are we this Friday morning in negotiations to form a government?
Well, we're really not any further than we were before. I mean, as you said, President Emmanuel Macron made this call for parties to come together to create essentially a big, mostly centrist alliance to form a majority. And nobody's really heeded that call, which is not particularly surprising given that he's tried to do this before, whether it was first when he called this election, a bit more than a month ago, or in 2022 when he lost his absolute majority in parliament, and at that time too also called for a big party, people of goodwill on the left and the right to join him, and no one ever has. So really, it hasn't progressed. Each side has sort of camped in its position, or they refused to have any sort of deal with sort of people more further away from them on the political spectrum, and it's not really clear how that's going to progress. So unfortunately, it doesn't really appear to be getting far.
Give us a flavour, though, of the reactions, because, the New Popular Front, it includes France Vowed, also the Socialists, the Greens and the Communists. They have a strong view, and so too does Marine Le Pen, it seems.
So they do have a strong view. So the left, as you pointed out, the New Popular Front, which is that mix of the parties that you just mentioned, the first four that you just mentioned, they are trying to come up with one name of a person to sort of at least put forward as saying, this is the person that we would nominate to be prime minister. Now, the way it works in France is that Macron himself has the right to name whomever he wants as prime minister, but it has to be someone who can survive in parliament, could survive a no confidence vote. So it does need to have support of at least a big proportion of parliament, even if not necessarily an absolute majority. So they're still working on that. They haven't come up with a name yet. They might have one. They originally said they aimed to have one by the end of this week, which would mean today, or potentially the beginning of next week. And they don't want to work with people on the right. Now, if you look at the right, and even before you get to Marine Le Pen, sort of the Republicans, or more the center right, they don't want to work with anyone from France Vowed, which, as you mentioned, was that far left group that's part of the New Popular Front. And Marine Le Pen, similarly, though there's been some mixed signals from the National Rally. There was an interview by one of her deputies in the Figaro last night who said they wouldn't necessarily immediately try to go to a no confidence vote if the left was running things. Marine Le Pen then backtracked on that. So it's not quite clear actually if the far right, if the National Rally would immediately try to put in a vote of no confidence if there was a leftist government or not. But they're really, no one is aligned at this moment.
So, Alan, that's where we are in the politics, and not very far is what we're deducing from what you're telling us this morning. The financials, though, are looking pretty intimidating. Bloomberg reporting yesterday that the European Commission has told France it's going to need to find savings or new revenue of 15 billion euros a year to be able to be in compliance with EU budget rules. I mean, how difficult is it going to be for the next government to find that money?
Well, finding $15 billion euros a year would be quite difficult. That's exactly what's going to happen. So the 15 billion a year that you described, that's what the EU or the Commission is saying that France needs to do in order to comply with deficit reduction procedures. But essentially an opening negotiation, and France is going to come back with its own responses. The current finance minister is Bruno Le Maire, who's been the finance minister for 7 years. He continues to try to push for big deficit reductions in France, essentially to meet that target, in part because there is the European Union excessive deficit procedure, but also in part to reassure bond markets that France is cutting its debt and its deficit. But he's not going to be finance minister for much longer, and it's really not clear how France is actually going to respond to this, how it's going to respond to the excessive deficit procedure. Is it going to try to comply with EU rules? Is it going to try to get the EU to reduce its sort of demands? Is it going to just ignore EU rules? In part, I suppose it depends on what government is formed and sort of what political color it has. So that too is really not obvious yet, sort of exactly how that's going to play out. There's almost sure to be some conflict with the EU, because there always is in these kinds of negotiations, but whether it is sort of a traditional negotiation between a big European country and the Commission over this kind of deficit, something that's more of a real frontal conflict is yet to be seen.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.